way.
Only the ones on the single table.
All right, well, I'll invite people to come back, and if there's any comments or questions.
On the talk.
On the
or
talk.
on the film.
Well, I'm running here my photos from my Larrapin's walk, so I'm also happy to talk about that if people ask about that it was a wonderful walk.
Well, so you're inviting a question from someone. Okay, or a comment, yeah. Well, I would just like to say that when you mentioned Freud was Jung was very interested in the Faust story, right? And that was a big part of the Modern Metaphysics of the Soul book. It just occurs to me that Faust must have had a soul, or he couldn't sell his soul.
Of course.
And I'm looking back to my own adolescence when I wanted to find a soul, but the Christian church that I belonged to and the place where I lived wasn't into souls. So I couldn't stay in that. But it's still, just by leaving, you still don't find the soul. It occurs to me, and I'd like to ask you, do you think that, in my mind, where I lived then as an adolescent, and an adolescent is a person who desperately needs to find the soul, there just wasn't any soul there in the churches that I knew about. Now, if Faust had sold his soul, does that mean that now, today, many of us don't have any chance at all to find the soul because we don't have a soul to sell?
Well, look, that gets into some pretty deep theological questions about salvation and damnation and redemption. And I think the thing for psychology is that the soul is who you really are. And so we all have something that is who we really are, but for many of us, we don't know who we really are, and we pretend to be someone else. So our soul can be concealed and suppressed. And I think that's something that happens equally within a church environment, where people create a pretend identity and suppress their real identity. And Jung's theme of individuation is essentially aiming for the identity between the ego and the soul, or the ego and the self. So really the soul and the self are the same. So I think that the idea that we can sort of irredeemably have lost our souls is not something that really makes sense, because there's, if you look at it in terms of the Christian framework, there is always the potential of repentance. That is, we can say, sorry that I've stuffed things up so badly and I'd like to fix things up and obtain forgiveness. So this offer of forgiveness is a source of redemption and the recovery of soul, and it's something that I have great optimism for the world in terms of just recovery of a sense of who we really are.
I have a question about the phrase culture of imagination. Like we have in Australia we have a reasonably good attempt at arts and culture funding in our society now to help artists and musicians and people who want to help reflect our story back to us is sort of growing quite substantially in Australia. So do you think that there needs to be a bigger wave of arts and culture that is like at a community level, or is it enough that people go out to the theatre or films or popular entertainments, is that enough to help reflect back what we need to look at, or is there more that has to be done? Like street festivals, or you started alluding to initiation ceremonies and things like that with elders and things like that. So my question is, are we doing enough in that area, do you think, in today's society?
Look, absolutely not. Look, I think that our world is on a trajectory towards extinction.
Yep.
And I see that in the problem of climate change, where we are incapable of having a serious international conversation about the primary security risk to our existence on this planet. Yeah. And so this inability to look to the future is a failure of imagination. Yeah. And so there is a need for a culture of imagination, as you put it, and I see Jung's ideas as really helpful in articulating what a culture of imagination could be. And further, my study of this, I discussed it in the talk that I gave here last year, and actually 2 years ago, on a book by Jung called Aeon, which is looking at the theme of time and the structure of time, and where Jung looks at this, I suppose, vision of the transformation of the world as a goal of cultural imagination. So I think the other great thing about imagination that's lost in what Jung calls this materialist scientific worldview is that in imagination we construct our world, we build our own world, we create, we can create a fantasy world, we can also create a world that is grounded in real observation, but it's this act of telling a story that's an imaginative story that is world creating, and simply describing what we see in factual terms just doesn't cut it as an act of imagination. It doesn't construct a world, but that's what we need in order to have any sense of value. And so there's this loss of a sense of value in the world, which Jung sees in terms of the loss of soul.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I noticed in your talk you put a lot of emphasis on the scientific materialism, that's where Jung felt was, if I understood it right, that's where that was the impetus to try and find soul again, was in the face of a hostility coming from scientific materialism. Is that the idea?
Yes, I probably was a bit repetitive there, and I just didn't edit my talk sufficiently, so I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading it recently, and you gave a lot of weight to it, so I just...
Yeah. Well, I do give weight to it, because I think that it's a problem in the university environment. That is, that we had this philosophy that was born in the 18th century with the scientific enlightenment, and then came to quite a flowering in the 19th century, and then was in some ways systematised in the 20th century, of just I suppose, going back to the previous question, just a failure of imagination, and a failure to, I suppose, respect the heritage of human culture, but just presenting I suppose, a moral framework that, in some respects, I worry is a bit superficial. So yes, there is this problem that if we say only matter is real, which is the thesis of logical positivism, of scientific materialism, then we we lose the faculty of imagination. Like, we lose a lot that makes us human. And I think, again, in the context of climate change, I bring a lot of these things back to climate change as a sort of pressing moral question, that science has given us an enormous array of facts about the dangers of climate change, but it's like it hasn't put it into a story that makes it meaningful in a popular way. Now, I'm not sure if you would agree with that, but that's my fear about how the culture of scientific materialism has, in some ways, become separated from mass society, and it's like, you see it in politics, where there are these big political movements that are just quite hostile to science, and I wonder, like, where does the blame sit for that polarisation, for that dichotomy? It's not just the fault of all of those stupid people who are too dumb to understand science. It's also an issue about, to what extent is there a worldview that is not engaging with some of the springs of human identity?
I was going to say, is it really science's job to do that? That's not what science isn't constructing a mythology for us. Science is giving us facts, and it's got a lot of speakers who are becoming very good at presenting those facts in an accessible way to the public. And so really, if those facts aren't being picked up by the public and made into a cultural story, that's because you have, say, right-wing fundamentalism or something opposing those scientific views. In America, for example, you have this very shallow Christianity that is opposing what science is saying. It's not science's job. Science is doing its job, and it's also bridging the gap so that it can speak to the general population. I think beyond that, if it's making its findings accessible, then it's up to people within the culture to form a narrative out of that we can relate to.
Sure.
In terms of climate change, for example.
Yeah, sure. And it's not anybody's fault that the world is in such a mess. People are doing what they can. But the question is, where do the solutions come from? And to some extent, there is an argument that the solutions come from, let's just achieve a more scientific worldview, and that will fix up the world. But then I suppose what Jung is arguing is that human identity is an identity of soul, and the idea of soul is not something that is a scientific idea, but is a much deeper cultural idea. So the challenge is for, I suppose, people in the world to draw from scientific information to reconcile it with a spiritual identity.
But the problem the West has is that we have a scientific worldview which we can't reconcile with the traditional religious containers, and yet we either walk away from those containers or they get replaced by a very shallow view of, Pentecostalism, fundamentalism, or they get replaced by something New Age, or,
Whereas
we're lost for finding this kind of container for the soul once we get a scientific worldview.
And Jung is really a great psychopomp in this, like Virgil helped Dante in the Inferno. Jung is helping us in terms of saying, how can we achieve that reconciliation of faith and reason? How can we draw on our scientific and cultural heritage to bring together science and religion in a way that's coherent?
I think it's very difficult. It's a major problem we have.
I think going back to what you were saying earlier about we're facing certainly the extinction of civilization, if not the mass extinction of species and the collapse of capital-based economies and so forth. Crisis generates change, I think, and crisis generates change not by presenting a scientific materialistic kind of answer, but by challenging us who are facing this crisis to go deep into this creative space, this place of emptiness. You can call it soul if you want, but that brings up a lot of baggage. So if we drop the label of soul and call it a creative space that is for a creative emptiness, or a not knowing that we all have within us, and we agree to go there and to then create some answers to this impending extinction that we're facing. I think we don't know what the answer is, but we have a chance to create something that's totally new that we're not aware of yet.
I think it's good to repurpose old words. So a word like soul has obviously connections with the Christian dogmas of going to heaven after you die. And that's a very different sort of framework, a different cosmology from what Jung is looking at. So he's saying we need to recover a sense of soul as our true identity of ourself. And it points to a range of these old metaphysical words, like, heaven is the big one, where one of the themes that we were talking about on the Larapinta Trail was the meaning of heaven, and just this idea of heaven as the order of the cosmos rather than anything supernatural. And I think what Jung is doing is he's really quite radically excluding anything supernatural from his worldview. And he's saying, and this is actually an idea that goes back to Calvin, that anything that does not that can't reconcile with our modern scientific understanding has to be reinterpreted. So the concept of heaven, with all of the traditional mythology that brings, the concept of salvation, like you were talking, Merlin, about the extinction threat, and so we talk about saving the world in terms of averting the extinction threat. It's not about this sort of Christian fantasies about rapture and escape. It's about how can we actually transform our life on this planet in order to continue to flourish.
Yeah, I'm curious, Robert, your trek on the Larapinta Trail, how did that affect your understanding of Jung's book from before you went on the trek to coming back from it? Did that have some effect?
I think it's more that you go out to the desert, and on our first day we climbed up a high mountain and we had a conversation about where we were, and we were looking back to Alice Springs and forward to this really seemingly... Oh, here we are. This is on top of Mount Sonder. Gaining a sense of the eternal. I think that's there's a sense of the desert as unchanging and really tough and robust, but then also that our modern world is having absolutely massive impact on this robust world. The scale of fire you may have seen in some of these photos is just extraordinary. And if people have been following the news about the fires in the Arctic Circle, you know, the whole planet is burning. And people say that all of these big old trees in Central Australia can't survive through climate change because the hotter environment and the invasive pest weed species is just enough to generate such hot fires that the trees used to be able to survive the cooler fires, but they cannot survive these hot fires. So I think that there's, I suppose, an apocalyptic dimension to climate change. That's been one of the themes that I've been really interested in. Just how, when you read the sort of apocalyptic literature, how it relates to what is actually happening on our planet and can provide some meaning to our circumstances today.
When we were on our little cruise from Singapore down eventually to Cairns, I was surprised at the large amount of open ocean round through the islands of Indonesia and so forth. We'd travelled for a long time without seeing any land at all. When you look at a globe of the world, it seems quite small compared with Australia. But anyway, it's large amounts of ocean. And I was reflecting there on a comment by my chemist friend who said that if you pick up a teaspoon of that ocean water, it'll have in it molecules of basically everything you find in the chemist shop. Sunscreen, human hormones, Panadol, it's all there in one teaspoon of ocean water. Just appalling, really. The extent of our intervention in the global systems.
Robert, I'm curious as to how being in this landscape, how this landscape worked on you.
Look,
in terms of your soul,
yeah.
but the experiences. I don't know how many days you spent here.
Yeah, we had 20 days.
20 days,
and
so it's considerable time.
Walking 200 kilometres, carrying a pack weighing 20 kilograms. So I got very sore feet, and I was really surprised at how hard it was because it went up and down big mountains, and it just forces you to draw on reserves of endurance and perseverance and patience and organisation, which are all values that we were talking about it in terms of just practical competencies, that doing something like a really big bushwalk, it just lifts your understanding of what you can achieve as a person, and so that is just character building in that sense. But then I think, especially being in the really old country of Central Australia, where these rivers are more than 300 million years old, and the geology goes back 1 billion years, and these mountains, when they first rose up, were higher than the Himalayas, and the geology of Central Australia is absolutely astounding. So you walk down these 300 million year old riverbeds, and they just have a rainbow array of different rocks that have come from all the different periods of when it was covered by sea, and when it was although this river, the Fink River, the Larapinta River, has existed in its current riverbed for 300 million years, so it was not a part of the inland sea. So getting that sense of the age of our planet, and then just how short our human lives are by comparison to this long stability. I find that's a really profound thing. So I gave a talk last week at Lurie Uniting Church on the theme on earth as in heaven. And so there's this question of how in the desert you feel that the stability of the environment is reflecting an orderly framework of the cosmos. And so there's this sense of getting away from any sort of supernatural theories of mythology and just integrating our ideas like the idea of heaven with our natural scientific understanding.
Yeah, and I guess, you made reference to mythology in the presentation, and I suppose the mythology of this land.
Well, that's another absolutely profound area where Aboriginal occupation for 60,000 years has just created the songlines and a really deep mythology that, again, is just under sustained assault by our modern soulless world. And so finding some respect, as I commented in my remarks on Jung, for Indigenous culture is another profound dimension of being in the desert. And the Larapinta Trail is partly designed as a sort of a songline, just recovering that sort of Indigenous sense of place and the sort of reverence for the earth.
I would imagine that you would come back quite changed after spending 20 days in that landscape and in that mythology. Did you come out of this feeling quite different?
Well, I think I went into it looking at it as a type of spiritual pilgrimage. And so I think just losing 3 kilograms and knowing that I could walk 200 kilometres is something that was the hardest thing I'd ever done. So it's really changing personally at that level. But I think I've been interested in these sorts of transformative ideas for a long time, and so I felt like it was a good opportunity for me to crystallise my own thinking, my own philosophy, and looking at Jung as one of the great profound thinkers of recent times. Just how it was a great opportunity to just reflect on his ideas in Modern Man in Search of a Soul, and think about what that means for us.
I'm sure that landscape had its way with you, if you like. I don't know if you relate to that, but just being in it and sleeping on that land for those number of nights.
Yeah, look, I really like that idea that there's the Aboriginal mythology believes in the existence of spiritual beings within sacred sites, and that's a way of thought that look, I've just always been really ambiguous about that sort of language. Just the idea of God as an intentional entity just hasn't really been the way I think. I suppose I'm looking at it in philosophical terms and seeing that the environment does have an identity that provides the adaptive context for everything within the environment, and that can be understood in spiritual terms as saying that there is a spiritual presence, and especially within the gorges where these beautiful waterholes are surrounded by rock walls and these ghost gum trees and reflections of the deep blue sky.